Hello, hello. Welcome to another Polestar Pilates Hour. It's great to have you joining Shelly and me today. Thank you, Shelly, for joining as we talk about springs today. Hey, just a little reminder that this next week, Shelly and I are celebrating the company's 30-year anniversary. We'll talk about a little bit more at the very end, but for those that are coming on now, we'll remind you again later, we will not be having a webinar next week. We will be going to our licensee meeting, visiting with them, and talking about the future of Polestar Pilates all around the world. And speaking of all around the world, we'd love to see where you're joining us from today. Shelly and I love to see a lot of familiar names of our friends from around the world, and we really thank you for joining us. Hopefully we have some great information for you today. We've had a lot of requests for some of these things now, and that's what we're trying to bring to you, our requests that you've given to us. Shelly, what's new for you?
Yeah, getting excited to see all of our licensees that we've not been able to see for the last several years. So usually I get to see them a little bit more frequently. So I'm just super excited for that. Feels like it's going to be recharging my batteries a little bit. So very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, and I think along that lines, we had gone back and forth just coming off of COVID as we were making plans for this and thinking, wouldn't it be great to invite all of Polestardom to an event, which we're now about 15,000 graduates around the world and friends more than that. And wouldn't it be great to invite everybody? We just knew that it would not be conducive yet with the travel and the cost and the recession and a lot of those things going on around the world. But we want you to know that we'll be thinking of you and appreciating all of your support. We would be nothing if it wasn't for you and those of you that have gone through the education or interested in our learning. So let's go into some Mentimeter today. All of you are familiar with Mentimeter. We've got a couple slides to kick us off, as we're going to be talking today about springs and spring tension. And we get so many questions about this, obviously, as an education company. Our manuals are filled with all the answers, but they still aren't quite enough answers. And so a lot of times when somebody asks Shelly, how many springs should I use for this exercise? And Shelly's
Everybody together. Let's say it together.
What would Shelly say to that? Should be the Mentimeter slide.
That should have been the Menti slide. Well, Melissa gave it away yesterday, which made me literally laugh out loud. It depends. Good. Yay!
Good job, Sunid. You win.
Yay! Everybody's putting it in. Because it's so true. You guys know from teaching, if you have somebody who is, 5'2" versus 6'2", and I use Sherry, Betts, and Brent. They're very different sized people. There's no way that they can use the same springs and have the same experience. They could use the same springs,
Yeah.
but their experience would be really, really different. And so that's where we want to dive a little bit deeper into the what do you want, what's your intention with it, and all of these things that we're gonna talk about a little bit. So
very good. Well, we're gonna wait till we get a good number in there, because like I said, we're about 100 participants and we want to see a lot of you inside of Mentimeter. Let's get those numbers going.
The numbers growing a little bit.
And one of the things that it's going to come back to, and we're going to talk about it today some, is the science really related to physics. When we look at springs, right? See if I can get the spring to show up here. It's really physics, right? It's tension, it's recoil, it's direction, it's length of levers, it's center of gravity, it's the moment arm. Those are all factors in physics that allow us to try to interpret and make sense of how things work. And Joe Pilates was no stranger to the physics of it. He knew what he wanted to create. We'll talk about this in a little bit, of load and assistance, and how we could learn by having a varied load. And the varied load is created by the elasticity of the springs and the direction of the spring. So the better we understand this sort of tension length curve and how levers are applied to length and tension, right? So we know in a spring and TheraBand, as you lengthen it, the resistance or assistance increases, right? What are some common questions that you get, Shelly, regarding spring tension and those kind of things? It's a little more on the, the more advanced student asking the question of what they know about springs.
Well, I hope, and I just want to add this in because I think it'll be really valuable because you talk about load so frequently, and you'll say, "Oh, such and such about load." And I thought, and we can talk about it whenever you want to, but I thought it would be really nice to just give a quick explanation of what do you really mean by load? Like, what are the different things that could be considered load? And when does load help somebody? When does load challenge somebody? Because it's not always, as we know as seasoned Pilates teachers, it's not always heavier springs mean more work and lighter springs mean less work. It's often the opposite of that. And when students in the teacher training have that epiphany, it's like, oh, I see now that it's this big spectrum. So I thought, and this doesn't really answer your question, but I thought if we started with that, that might be helpful because I don't know that everybody really knows that. So as soon
Yeah,
as
I
we
think that's,
see,
yeah,
yeah, as soon as we see some of the answers here, I think it might be good to just go into that a little bit.
sounds good. Let's see what our group is saying or some of the challenges, and that will help us also know where we spend a lot of our time today.
It depends. I love it. See,
Um,
I'm not the only one. It really does depend.
it's a Libra thing, it's a balance. Well, it depends.
It's the truth, though. It's the truth. One of the first ones I saw that went by was the different manufacturers having
Mm,
different colors. And I
yeah,
was just teaching at a studio this past weekend that had peak equipment, so I had to reset my brain. I also teach so much all over the world that not only is it not, what I'm used to, it's not even any brand that we would necessarily see here in the United States. So I do have a thought. Can I share my thought on the springs really quick, kind of in response to that?
yeah,
Do you mind?
of course. That's
So
right
one
here.
of the things it's the whole goes back to forest and trees. So are you trying to memorize a a particular setting for every single exercise, which in the beginning students do that often, and and there's nothing wrong with that, but that's some 200 exercises with 200 different spring settings, and that doesn't even take into consideration the different body sizes and what we want to accomplish. So one of the ways, and especially when I'm in another country where I'm having to think about is how do I relate this, some of the springs don't have colors at all, is are you going for a very light type of a spring setting, maybe something for introducing supine arms on the reformer? You don't
Yeah.
need much. It's not really going to assist or resist at this moment. You just want somebody to go through the movement. Is it kind of a medium setting? Is it a really heavy setting, which is often the assistance that we're talking about? First time somebody does a hamstring three on the chair, or I can't remember all the original name for that, but the lifting up into a rounded position like elephant, but on the chair. Sometimes you need to spring it really heavy because the person, it's not that they can't do it or they're not strong enough. It's they don't know how to do it yet, and they don't even know what the potential is. So you spring it really heavy, they almost have no choice. You're kind of standing behind them so they don't flip over, and they can feel the movement a couple of times, and then kind of it's like, okay, now we can go back to a little, maybe a lighter spring setting that you can do the movement with better control. So that's one tip, is kind of just think, is it pretty light? You're not really looking for anything, maybe a tiny bit of resistance just to go through the movement. Is it kind of medium? Is it heavy? And then that's going to help you to really start to understand what's the purpose of the spring, not what's the color of it, but what's the purpose of it.
Yeah. As you're speaking and I'm looking at a lot of these answers here, things like body type, or some of the challenging things of how to match the right, load assistance, which we'll talk about in a second, to be able to challenge or assist the body that's in front of us. I think that's what we have to always go back to, is how do we make Pilates accessible to be a positive movement experience to facilitate the change or the experience that we're desiring to experience. Now, sometimes it is a whole body experience, and we know our springs, and we go through our reformer class and we call out our springs, and we've learned those in experiences. And then all of a sudden we have somebody that has a different body type that's in that same class. And what we try to express is it's not the same thing for them. A red and a blue spring in feet and straps is not the same as it is for somebody that is slender and, maybe 100 pounds dripping wet with long skinny legs is very different than a man with, like Shelly said, 6'2", 280 pounds, and they're putting their feet in straps with a red and a blue spring. That's that's like doing hundreds of ankle weights on. It's like no springs. Exactly. So I do agree with you. I think that's probably the biggest challenge we have. And I've said this a number of times. I said the biggest challenge we have in movement science is knowing how much load is appropriate. And we have to understand load very well before we can understand how to manipulate load. And to understand that load has many different faces, right? So this is part of Peter O'Sullivan's work out of Adelaide in Australia. He talked a lot about graded load. And this is what Joseph Pilates did 100 years ago, is he had his calisthenic, whole body, yoga-based kind of mat routine that he taught. And there were people who couldn't do a lot of the exercises. And at the same time, he was creating and developing the reformer, which was able to hold the legs in a position that would look like the hundreds until they were strong enough to be able to do it without the springs, or that it would guide the movement to a successful place. So this idea of graded load is our biggest strength in Pilates, but it also is the biggest challenge of movement. And so let's talk a little bit, as you asked, Shelly, of what are types of load, right? What does load consist of? And, load is necessary. If we don't have load as humans, we have a problem, right? We have decreased bone density if we don't have load from gravity in our vertical bipedal position as human beings. We have to have load. Load is what tells us where we are in space. Load is what allows us to move. If there's no load, we wouldn't know where we are in space. Our proprioception depends on load, right? So, or the load coming on, load coming off tells us where our body is in space by tension of the muscle spindle fibers, the mechanoreceptors in our joints. All of these things are dependent upon load. Now, load in and of itself could be simply gravity. So gravity is load. It's a certain percentage of our body weight that is pushing down from the spin of the earth in its relationship to the sun. So that's a normal kind of load. So sometimes we manipulate gravity. So, how do we manipulate gravity? Oh, we lay on our side, or we do footwork on the reformer. Instead of jumping up against gravity, we jump against some springs. So we can manipulate gravity. Other types of load are created by length of levers. So I could take a 1 pound weight and hold it close to my chest, and it's very light, very easy for me to maneuver around. But I hold that 1 pound weight out in front of me, and pretty soon that 1 pound weight becomes much, much heavier. The load is much greater the longer the load on where the muscles are working, right? So it'd be like my deltoids in the shoulder and my neck muscles and my trapezius muscles that have to keep my arms suspended, the rotator cuff muscles in the shoulder for that longer period of time. So load can be weights, load can be gravity, load can be the length of levers, load could be endurance, how long we have to hold it, load could be repetitions, how many repetitions did we do, load can be tempo, how fast did we do it, how slow did we do it. We play with these types of things all the time in our class, right? I mean, what happens is slow always easier? Not at all, right? So we think of capoeira. Capoeira in Brazil has a regional and I forgot the other one, sort of like martial arts with Kung Fu and Tai
Tai
Chi,
Chi.
right? But there's, the slower form, Angola, it's called Angola. So the slower form of Capoeira is and can be much more challenging than the momentum and speed that moves the body through space in the regional version of Capoeira. So there are times where, we use slowness, right? We slow it way down and the load becomes much, much greater to us, right? And there's times where we speed it up and the load becomes greater to us, right? So we're always trying to find something that matches. And I think this is the key takeaway. Shelly sort of gave you a good baseline of, do we want a light load, a medium load, or a heavy load to be able to assist, resist, or guide the movement through space? And we have all this beautiful equipment to be able to do that with. So that's really cool that we have so much flexibility of manipulating load. But understanding again, load is gravity, load is additional weight or resistance. It could come from TheraBand, springs, whatever. Load is length of lever in gravity. So the longer, think of doing dead bug or femur arcs compared to doing straight leg or scissors or the 100 with the legs out straight in front of you, right? The leg weighs the same amount of weight. There's no difference in the weight of the leg, but by having it out straight against gravity, the load, the fulcrum, the length of the lever make the load much, much greater. We said that endurance, so again, the 100 is a good example. Maybe it's easy to hold the legs there for a few seconds or one breath, but doing it for 10 breaths is very challenging. That's a lot of load, right? We also know that repetitions create load. So we know we go do weights and we do how many repetitions? Oh, I'm going to do a set of 10 repetitions and I'm going to do 3 sets, right? So we load through sets until we fatigue the tissue and we get tissue adaptation. Endurance, I'm going to go running. I start running a mile and over a period of a couple months, I'm up to 13 miles getting ready for a marathon, right? So I'm loading my endurance, my cardiovascular load, my endurance on my tissues of running, right? The elasticity in the tissues. So load has many faces and it is essential. And now we can talk, and I want Shelly to talk a little bit about, she often will use the idea of a heavy bar and changing where its orientation is to the body. Where is that load assisting or is that load resisting?
Right. And you'd think again, if you're not really used to like the new students coming in who can't do a roll up very well, most probably because they don't have enough mobility where they need mobility and they don't understand the timing of it. And it's just like, oh, I got to get up and I just go for it. So if we give them a heavy bar, and I've had this happen, or students in class that I'm teaching a mat class in our studio, and they'll be struggling a little bit with the roll up, and I'll hand them a weighted bar or even just a thick, a pretty thick dowel, and they're looking at me like, okay, I just told you that this is hard for me. You can see I can't do it. Why on earth would you hand me a weight? That doesn't make any sense.
You're so
And
mean.
because I'm the meanest teacher ever. No, but if you've had, and again, I'm probably, I can see you all, not really, but kind of nodding and thinking, yeah, I know where this is going. When the weight, certainly if I took the bar overhead, that's not going to be helpful at all. That's going to be really, really hard. But as I move the weight over my body, it begins to assist me because it's changing the leverage. And Brent, I want you to talk about this a little bit. We talked about this in our prep about this idea of stiffness and all of those types of things. I want you to talk about that. But so this is one of the things that we're talking about. So where can giving somebody a weight actually make it a little bit easier for them? We're going
No.
to changing the length of our levers in a way. We're not. The lever is the same, but I'm equalizing it a little bit.
It has to do with the center of gravity, right?
Mm,
So, for example, if you're doing a roll up and you put the weight out in front of you, what you've done is you've taken a distribution of weight and moved it closer to the center of gravity. So the amount of work it is for the body to roll up to that center of gravity, that's what we do in a roll up, is much, much less, because there's more weight over the center of gravity. We have more stability structurally. You see this all the time in architecture. You wonder how buildings have, things that hang out like this over with no structure underneath it. But what it has is it has a really significant weight over the center of those things, pulleys pulling those beams down to make it so that the load is not so great that it would cause structural weakness. And we're sort of the same way. And so we play this game all the time, right? So, one of our fun challenges to talk about is what's the difference between a roll up versus a rollover, right? They both require the same amount of spine mobility. One initiates from the feet going up over the head, and the other initiates with the head coming up over the feet. But what is the difference? Let's assume that we have the same amount of spine mobility and flexion in both exercises. What is the difference between those exercises? I'd love to know, like, your thoughts. You can write in the chat if you want. But Shelly, what are some things that come to your mind thinking of just by changing the orientation of the exercise? And you've often mentioned, give me a rollover any day over a roll up. But why?
Yeah,
Same mobility, same gravity, same orientation, same
right.
body parts.
I think for me, it very much feels like I can get my legs in a rollover. I can get my legs over my trunk easily. I don't have a problem getting my legs over and starting to roll. And for me, that just makes the rollover so much easier. I've got my weight over my body, and I have a mechanical advantage now of just being able to continue to let that go.
Yeah.
When I go a roll up, it's much more challenging for me. I don't have any assistance in flexing my spine. So in the moment my pelvis starts to move into a posterior tilt and spine flexion, it's already moving my spine. In the roll up, I have to do that kind of on my own without much help. And so for me, that's my sensation of the difference between one versus the other. So that's
Yeah.
that's what
And,
I
and,
feel.
and again, for example, let's say that somebody has heavier lower extremities, heavier legs and buttocks, and a smaller upper torso, right?
Hmm.
The center of gravity is going to be lower on that, and the roll up is going to be much easier than the rollover for them. Or
Right.
if somebody had a decreased hip flexion range of motion, like maybe they only get to 75 degrees. Well, now that that load has to come into the torso more, and the rollover is a much harder exercise for them
Right.
than a roll up. Somebody who has a very rigid thoracic spine, we talked about mobility, everybody having the same mobility, but if you can't get the mobility to come up over that center of gravity, getting the body and the shoulders closer to the belly button or the navel, it becomes very hard to do a roll up. So it just depends on the individual. It's a little bit of a trick question. What I would like you to think about, and maybe this is a good segue, is thinking of the term stability, and more importantly, the term dynamic stability. And that dynamic stability is often defined by stability or stiffness moving along the length of the spine or other joints, depending on where the load is, right? So the person that has greater segmental control, again, we use the word control and load a lot, right? Greater segmental control is going to have a much easier time with a roll up or a rollover. It just won't matter, because they can stiffen a joint and move another joint around it much easier than somebody who has a strategy of moving 6 or 7 vertebrae together. So the mobility can make a big difference. And this is where spring selection becomes incredibly important, right? We want to teach somebody, let's stay with the same example of a roll up or a rollover. We want to teach somebody how to do a segmental roll up. And we want them to be able to do it more as a movement exercise and less as an abdominal exercise or a hip flexor exercise. So if we add springs to them, how much spring do we want to add to them? Let's say in a roll up with spring assistance on the trapeze table. What would be appropriate for somebody who rolls up to the bottom of their shoulder blades and their legs come off the ground and they have to go into Valsalva and heave themselves up into a seated position? How do we select that? Well, what are some tools that you've used, Shelly, to be able to, make good decisions of how much is enough? How much do they need?
Yeah, I mean, I go if it's somebody's first time and I've watched them, I've either done the screening with them or I just, gone on to let's do a roll up and see, see how that goes. I want to, and this is something I heard a lot from Angela Crowley when I was going through my gyrotonic training. There were times when, and I think this comes a lot from her Feldenkrais background, is she would say, just give somebody the movement. Don't make them think about it. Don't make them do anything. Just give them the experience. And then once they've had the experience, maybe then they'll understand and they'll be able to do it just fine. So on a balanced body trapeze table, for a roll up or a roll down, I'll give them the long purple springs because I know that most people, unless somebody is just really, really huge, weighs a lot, very muscular, two purple springs is great for a roll up. And they will often say, well, I don't really feel anything. It's like, excellent. Just go with it. Just feel the movement in your body. And then I might drop down to the yellow springs, the long yellow springs, and see how that goes. And one of the things in kind of in what you're talking about of the roll up and the segmental mobility and segmental control is we're really very goal oriented about getting somewhere, right? I want to get up or I want to get down to the table. And if we can think of all the time it takes to do that, that there is, I mean, if we had all the vertebrae, if I had a spine, right? All the lower vertebrae are they're just staying, they're not doing anything. The pelvis in relationship to both the spine and the pelvis to the femur, they're just staying. It's not doing anything yet on a roll up because you've got all this up here that has to change before any of that needs to change. So the other idea I talk about is the timing, and then I have people practice this in a standing roll down. So in a standing roll down, it's very easy to do your chest lift. It's easy to keep going, and it's easy to keep, if this was the pelvis sitting upright, it's really easy for me to see at the moment that I actually need to move my pelvis over the top of my femur. And it's not until late in the movement.
Yeah.
But we want to, have that feeling of, using our legs and using the hip flexors just to create something that looks like a roll up and you get up to sitting. Um, but it actually, we need to keep the pelvis relatively steady so that, we can move our spine. And I love that you brought that up because I don't think that we consider that enough of what isn't moving. We always think of, well, what is moving? But you have to have something be a little bit stable for a moment, maybe even just for a second, to allow movement to happen.
Yeah, in yoga, they refer to the bandha. Bandha, defined by Simon Borg Olivier, was a co-contraction around a motion complex or movement complex. So you could have a mula bandha, which would be a stiffness moment of the pelvis, let's say in lumbar area, while you are rolling your spine up. Like, how would that stiffness look? Or, as you eloquently put, I love the roll down as a way to teach the roll up. A standing roll down is teaching them where that segmental movement is without the stress or load of gravity. Rather, they're now having assistance from gravity, right? Or we're putting the trapeze table and we're giving them assistance. Sarah Edward talked about having them start sitting up and having assistance to roll down and back, and sort of working through those preconceived notions. A lot of people have I'm not flexible, or I don't have hamstring length, or my spine is too stiff, or my abdominals are too weak.
Mm-hmm.
The worst one would be if my stomach's too weak, but I think that they do just fine eating and digesting their food, but it's really the abdominals. And so how do we, this again comes back to the topic today, is selecting springs. And I wanted to bring up an idea of, understanding the common thread through the exercises. So for example, if we look at spine articulation and flexion, or spine articulation into extension, like the swan, And then we look at its relationship to function. So the swan is related to things like a tennis serve or a golf swing or a volleyball spike or throwing a javelin or all the things that are up here into extension or putting your luggage up over your head in the plane. It all has this tie. And what we want to do is we want them to be able to have that distribution of movement for distribution of force in their functional daily lives. So when I look at that, I think, are they able to do it or not? And this goes back to a lot of our assessment tools that we're well known for in Polestar. But we look and we see, do they have mobility in that direction independently? They have mobility, they can go into thoracic extension, or they can do a roll up, or they can Z sit, right? They can long sit. Do they have this naturally, or is it something we're going to have to work on to restore maybe some structural mobility, or is it really just strategy? So when we look at those things, then we think, okay, why are they not able? And this is the purpose of this particular webinar today. We're asking, why are they not able to do the roll up? Why are they not able to do this? Is this a learning problem? Like, it's new, they're not aware of their body. Well, when we cue them, they get it. But if they don't get that, if they don't get the cueing and it doesn't make a difference, then it's usually going to be one of two things. It's going to be a lack of control or control against the load, the natural load of that activity, or it's going to be they literally don't have the mobility to do that activity. And we're saying in today's lecture, we're making assumptions they have the mobility, and we're dealing with people that are struggling with control and with load. So that typically means we're going to have to select a spring or a spring selection or an orientation that is going to assist enough, right? If you can think of one of the sayings I've said for 30 years at least, is we want to have as much as necessary, as little as possible. And there's a reason for that. So in our spring selection, it might vary. We might not pick the right springs the first time, and we just keep testing it. So it's like, let's try 2 purple springs. Oh, that looked really easy to do the roll up with 2 purple springs. Let's go with 2 yellow springs and see if that has a little bit more challenge, and if you can still work through it and really understand how I can allow segmental movement rolling up and to find some new motion that could make the exercise a little bit easier for me when I'm doing it on the mat, or I'm doing it on the reformer or another apparatus. And so, to me, I want to see the big 30,000 foot functional activity, the thread of all the exercises that reinforce that movement that we have in our beautiful library of Pilates movement. And then I want to see what is limiting them from being able to do it successfully the way they want to. And if it comes down to they need assistance to do it, man, we have the most beautiful environment in the world to do it. And we just got to keep trying and dealing with it, taking into consideration things that we know already. And maybe, Shelly, let's talk a little bit about when we look at the diversity of our client base as it pertains to spring selection. What are some of the things that would indicate to you that you need to use heavier or lighter springs in the situation of assisting somebody with an exercise? What's some of the criteria that you would look at?
What I might see and then make the change on that.
Yeah, you're teaching a reformer class. Yep. And you got a diverse group of bodies in there. Yep. And what are things that you already sort of have a sixth sense about that you're probably going to give a different spring assignment to somebody? What is that based off of? What is your experience telling you to make that change?
Right. Well, one is we've already mentioned, which is the size of the person. So how much muscle mass, and muscle's heavy. Limbs are heavy. If you've ever suspended and held somebody's leg, even their arm for a little while, it's heavy. So how big are they, or how small are they in terms of that? So I'm already thinking ahead to that, but I'm also, and that's not the sole determining factor, but I'm watching also the quality of their movement. So even just how they approach it, not to say that they're struggling, but maybe they are they're going for it, right? And really aggressive and fast mover. That's something I might take into consideration. Also, are they doing things like that little mini Valsalva bracing? I'm watching their facial expression. I'm watching their jaw, watching their shoulders. Are they preparing to do something, or are they doing that to get through a movement? And so even like if we were talking about the reformer class, watching people do footwork. Is it smooth and coordinated? And how is their quality? Or are they pushing really fast? That might cause me to lower somebody's spring on that, um, to send the point home of this is not a power movement. This is a control movement and a smoothness. But if they're grunting a lot, if they're holding their breath, I'm thinking in exercises where there is something that they have to maintain, like feet in straps or the 100. I'm thinking already they need some help with that. They need support. And so I sometimes will think of the springs as the replacement almost to a particular set of muscles. So I'm thinking that in feet and straps on the reformer, even just doing the simple leg arcs up and down, I'm already thinking the springs now have become their hip flexors, right? If we could take their hip flexors out, take them off to the side, and the springs would bring the legs up through the strap movement, and then they use their hip extensors to go down, and there's enough weight that they don't really need their hip flexors in either direction. So that's also what I'm thinking about. And then I want to go back to something that Sarah wrote in a comment way early was, and I'm kind of extrapolating a little bit from her, but it made me think of this, is we want to vary the spring settings. Once somebody gets it, right, we're going to work with them where they are for a moment, and then we want to expand on that. So, and this is something that Juan talks about, that you talk about, a lot of people, Victor talked about it. If you hear from Daniel, he talks about it, is this idea of spontaneity with movement. So so feet and straps on a red and a blue. Okay, great. I can do that all day long. Just going up to two reds or down to a red and a yellow, just slightly heavier, slightly lighter, it's a different experience for me. I've been doing this exercise for 30 years. So we want to be continually, oh, and Sherry talked about this too in the one we did about bone health and osteoporosis. We need to have novel weight, novel load, changes in movement, changes in stimulus. All of these things are really important. So I just wanted to mention that because Sarah wrote that early, and I think that's really important too. Is once you've met somebody, they've learned it. Now do it a bunch of different ways. What's the heaviest safe setting you could put on? What's the lightest setting you could use that's safe? And let them go for it.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think that also looking at the novelty of movement for somebody is super important versus somebody more experienced, correct? And so, somebody who doesn't have experience with springs or working with something like Pilates or gyrotonic system, that bringing them into a very safe area that they can just have the movement, I think is something you mentioned earlier from Angela Crowley. And just having that experience of movement is crucial, because one of the things we know in strategy and motor learning, a novice mover will over recruit and co-contract, right? They're going to co-contract the muscles around the joints. And so you think of learning to ride a bike as a child, or you have a child that you've taught to ride a bike, and we over recruit everything. We're holding all things in. As we learn, we become more and more efficient. And I think it's important for us to look at all these different factors, right? So we've talked about now, length of levers, the weight of the body, the size of the body, the novice to expert mover and their body awareness. We can look at even things like, purpose of the movement. And a lot of times the amount of assistance they need will change when they understand the purpose of the movement or how it can help them psychologically. So it's not always a physiological or load that way. It could be an emotional load. Another one that I like to use a lot, for example, with bent knee opening, laying on your back and having your legs open to the side. I love to bring and play with tempo, right? So we haven't talked a lot about tempo yet as load, but the tempo is so important as something that brings into function. So bent knee opening is a great exercise for rotostability of the trunk. So you think of subtle rotostability of things like walking and running and throwing and kicking and swimming. They all require rotostability because we're bipedal and our long levers, even in a horizontal orientation swimming, we require rotostability. But a lot of times we do the exercise so slow. It's not a hard exercise. It's a very easy exercise, but we do it so slow that it doesn't have any relevance whatsoever to the rotostability we need as humans or as bipedal animals. And so there's this sort of common understanding in movement science that as we move more towards a speed that is going to be more functional, right? It also has to become more subconscious. It has to be more automatic. It has to be more rhythmic, right? And so it's very fun for me to watch people try to interpret this because it's foreign. It's not, it's not me saying walk faster, walk slower. It's me saying, see if you can abduct the legs, in different times and create this stability. So what happens is typically two things have to happen for tempo to increase in a movement. One of them is going to be the range of motion has to shorten. And two is the amount of stiffness centrally has to increase. And that's what you're saying, Shelly, is like when we vary spring, when we vary tempo, when we vary orientation to gravity, right? These are our tools that are incredibly powerful to create the right, I see Sarah put the word in there, perturbation that Juan talks about. I like to think that I taught Juan that word perturbation, but he understands it really well and he uses it even better in his teaching. He's a master of perturbation. And that's what we're talking about is how do we use the springs and gravity and tempo and endurance to be able to create the right perturbation, right? The right challenge to the body's nervous tissue and muscle tissue and elastic tissues, the fascia system, to be able to replicate a healthier approach to functional activities. We have to always make it back to there.
Yeah, and I was thinking about you as you were talking about that. I was thinking back to the springs a little bit. So when you go slower, not ultra slow, but when you just go slower, a lot of times the accuracy with things can improve a little bit. So you're
Yeah.
going slow enough that you can kind of pay attention. This goes to what you were just saying, is as it gets faster, we can't think about it so right up in the front of our brain. We have to already own it. But you can slow things down a little bit and work on accuracy. And that's kind of where the springs come in. So when I'm using the springs to support my body, I can go a little bit slower. If we go just stay with the roll down, so I'm sitting on the trapeze table and I'm holding onto the bar with the dowel or the springs, and I roll down, I can go slow enough because the springs are really supporting my body that I can experience better alignment, better mobility, better
Mhm.
understanding. I can pause. You like to stop at different segments and do little rotations or do little movements and things. And you couldn't really do that, especially a new mover couldn't do that on a mat class, right? They can't roll partway down in a roll down and then just stay there and do a bunch of stuff. They don't have the mobility yet and they don't have the endurance yet.
Yeah.
So tempo, think about that, and the timing of the movements that you're doing is, again, let somebody learn it. I think we're so, it's like you've got to do it this way because in the manual this is an advanced exercise and you have to do it like this.
Yeah.
If you've taken from me recently, I challenge my students all the time, especially ones that have been teaching for a long time, is how can you start teaching the most advanced exercises on day one, right? Easy one, corkscrew. No person coming into a class, at least the people I see, can do corkscrew on the very first day if they've never moved and never done Pilates and never, don't have a movement background. But I can do a simple bridge with the feet on the floor and give them the spine mobility and the spine movement that is corkscrew. So how can we do that more frequently, and how can we do that with the springs? Thinking about the standing single leg pump on the chair and progressing that to forward lunge on the chair or going up front. And are we really using springs that support somebody in the standing leg
Mhm.
pump? I see all the time, oh, this person is new. I'm going to give them one white spring, and on a balanced body chair, the white spring is the lightest. I'm just going to give them one white spring and let them do the standing leg pump with that because they're new. And I think, are you kidding me? You might as well not have a spring and just stand and lift your leg up and down because the
Yeah,
whole
no
point of
feedback.
that is to have not only the spring, and this is another point, I think I talked about this during the Swan um, webinar a couple of weeks ago, is, or last week, when was it? Is using the springs as leverage. So sometimes I don't want to extend the spring fully, right? Or I want to be able to lean into a spring. Think about the standing arm work at the end of the trap table. When we're facing away, I'm using the springs to help support my body. I don't want to stretch them all the way out, or I'm not going to have enough support. So think about that too on standing leg pump. What spring tension is going to hold their leg up? And then let them work to push it down. That's pretty easy for people to do. And then the learning happens when they allow the spring to help them come back up. And this goes again back to this idea of concentric and eccentric. Is the purpose of the movement something concentric? It might be the muscle is shortening and working to produce a movement, or is the muscle lengthening to produce a movement?
Yeah.
Both, we say both are a contraction, but one is in length and one is to lengthen and one is to shorten. So think about that too. What side of the movement are you on?
Yeah, and before we go into sort of concentric eccentric discussion, which I'd love to hit for the last little bit, I think that the concept here, and I see people getting it. Sanid has some good comments, and Eva and Flavi, their comments are very much appreciated. And it's exactly right, is that, modifications that we can make are things like we said, range of motion or tempo or, assistance, all of these things. And one of the things I want to reiterate here is that in motor learning, we have what's called external feedback and internal feedback, right? So we as teachers, mirrors, videos are external feedback. So something that is giving information to the client of, lengthen here or reach for this or move your leg through space like an arc or something like that. We're giving them external feedback, right? Internal feedback is where learning occurs. So that's where they're able to say, oh, I feel that, or, oh, that's challenging, or, oh my goodness, I can flex for my hips, or I could feel the segmental movement in the bridge. These internal feedbacks is where the learning happens. And that's why slower movement is more about internal feedback for the novice. So it's absolutely appropriate to play with a slower tempo because it's a slower load on the nervous system, right? Load is not just a tissue load. Tempo changes the load on the nervous system. But as we want that movement to become more rhythmic, more automatic, more more spontaneous, as we talk a lot about, then it's through practice that the nervous system learns how to do the movement from the spinal cord with simple commands from the cortex. And the reason why I bring that up is because the spine and the spinal cord, in particular, part of the nervous system, can produce a lot of our rhythmic movements that we do throughout our day. And if we're moving from a unconsciously incompetent state, we don't know what we don't know, and we as a teacher give them external feedback and we say, hey, you could move better. You could have a better organization. And then we take them a step further and we say, here's a great way to organize your movement. And so now they're conscious of a competent strategy. And then they practice. Now, that learning, and I think it's Flavi that was talking about it a little earlier, maybe Eva, is that we talk about neuroplasticity, right? So neuroplasticity, we know from research, actually happens in our sleep. It is the central nervous system's interpretation of internal feedback during the day. That might be an easy way to sort of put it there. So we can become better facilitators by creating an external feedback that is internally interpreted by the client that then is learned at night. Now, neuroplasticity could also be teaching bad habits, It's not just good habits. So it's really important that we don't interfere too much with the internal feedback and that learning and discovery, as long as it's moving in the right direction. And so our whole environment of manipulating load is why I think this is so challenging. I think it's tough. What we're talking about is not easy, right? That's why it takes years of experience to have the intuition that Shelly has or other great teachers have on this webinar, to be able to go, oh, you know what? I'm going to go with a lighter spring. I'm going to go with a heavier spring. I'm going to use this one as leverage. I'm going to use this one as a very light reminder of load, or I'm going to use this one to really wake up those proprioceptive fibers, to teach them so they feel it inside and it's not just outside. And we use these tools, and we might not even put those words to them. The words are not as important as the activity, but we're creating internal feedback of successful movement experiences that, as they practice them physically at nighttime or when they're sleeping, the neuroplastic action happens and it starts becoming part of their motor control and motor learning system.
Right. And I just was, as you were talking, I was just thinking about something that Christy and I share often, and Nicole as well, when we happen to be together usually when we're doing exams. And so one of the things that we write down often is, how would you get the person to do this? Now, you don't always have to have the exact right cue, because you can also, like Brent said, you can have lots of poor information going on. But something like, oh, okay, and I want you to stay in neutral. Right? How is the person supposed to do? They don't know what it is, and they don't know where the parts of their body are supposed to be in relationship. This doesn't have to do with the spring so much, but how how do you get people to understand that? And that's a really important piece of the external information going in. How do they know how to do it if they were to practice at home? That's what I ask, again, things I ask my students. If you give this exercise to somebody, how are they going to know if they're doing it the right way, or they're doing it at least the best way for their body? How do they know? You haven't told them anything. You haven't helped them. So maybe the help isn't a verbal cue. Maybe it's a TheraBand, right? Maybe it's a spring. Maybe it's buy an Allegro for your house because you really need to practice these movements over and over and over for your body. But do something
And use
to
this code because
give.
I get a commission when you buy a
Oh yeah,
reform.
mention my name and I get, no. But I mean, but think about it just in terms of cueing. And people are, how do you get somebody to do this exercise? Well, it's tough, but you've got to really invest in. And I think, this, I see what, 103 people on right now, and the, hundreds of people that are going to watch later. We're probably preaching to the choir a little bit, but are you actually giving useful information, whether it's your words, an image, an actual do this now, wait for this, do this? Are we giving them assistance? Maybe they need to lie on a foam roller so that the load, right, the stimulus is going into their body more. Maybe their nervous system is a little bit dense, kind of, and you're doing femur arcs. And I use this example often because it's just one that impressed me, 20 some years ago. They're doing femur arcs on the floor, and their body's moving all over, and you're saying, "Gosh, can you feel how your body's moving all over?" They're like, "Nope, don't get it at all." I'm like, "Okay." And you put them on a foam roller. And I remember the first time somebody did this, and I just thought, okay, this is not going to end well. This is the worst thing that you could do because they can't even do it on the stable floor. And why would you give them this rolly thing to be on? And within 2 repetitions, man, these
Bam.
people are like, do, 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 nothing's moving because their nervous system needed more information, right? And Jennifer, who just put something into
Yeah.
the chat, is talking about video, right? Photos and video are great. It's, you're not stimulating the receptors, but you're stimulating this receptor of, oh my gosh, that's what I was doing. And it's amazing at whatever level. I do it with myself. I'm teaching a class on Zoom and I'm like, wait, is that me? So we all need this type of
I
feedback. And
don't
the
get an applause
springs,
at all.
whoa, the springs provide an opportunity for you to slow things down and give that movement to somebody, that information in the beginning when it's so useful, and then challenge them like crazy, right? Whatever that means for that person.
It's such great information. I wanted to finish up with a comment that Sunit had made about a dilemma, right? Feet and strap dilemma with a fragile elderly woman. And, if you go too light springs and you go too low, their back comes up off. If you put too heavy of springs on, it lifts their butt up as if they're going into a short spine or something. And one thing I would suggest is, again, play with the concept of range of motion and spring load. So, for example, if I wanted to challenge her, I could go with a little bit heavier spring, but keep her in the 45-degree and down range of motion, and then go with a lighter spring and play with her in the 45 to 90-degree range of motion. It doesn't have to be that I have a perfect spring for the whole range of motion. I could break it down until she understands and feels, oh, that's what you meant by keeping my pelvis quiet, or moving from my hips and not from my back. It's like, yes, that's the difference between hip flexion and spine flexion. Oh, okay. And then you can come back with a spring in between it, or spring load, and let them start exploring it. So now they're maybe going from 45 down about halfway the distance they did with the heavier springs, and up about halfway the distance they did with the lighter springs. And my reasoning here is that, and we've said this a couple of times, is how important is it to meet the patient or the client where they are? And we are the ones that are the experts in manipulating load and range of motion and orientation to gravity and length of levers, how many springs. And I say we're the experts, but that's the hardest part of our job. It's what differentiates us from just going in and plopping weights on something, in a gym. It really takes a lot of thought to create assistance and have that full spectrum all the way up into resistance, or into, Shelly mentioned, even a really heavy spring. We don't want the lever to move. We want it, but we want it to have a little bit of movement, but we don't want them really to move that pedal necessarily. It's giving them some real good proprioceptive feedback in their tissues to go, oh, that's where I'm moving from. Oh, my goodness, that's my glutes or my butt. I could feel it. How often do we get clients to go on independently to go, oh my goodness, I felt that in my butt. It's like, yeah, that's great. And I didn't have to tell you, squeeze your glutes, right? We created the load to create the experience. So just some beautiful things. Shelly, we got to finish up here.
I know.
Any last minute comments?
When are we making these things longer? Yeah, well, I was just going to add on to what you said about
we make podcasts. Podcasts we can make longer.
Excellent, good. You were just talking about meeting this client at different parts of the movement with different levels of assistance or not. And also think about, and this again, this doesn't have to do with springs, but just think about, what are you telling somebody? And feet and straps is one of my my exercises, because we give such poor information. So be careful you don't let your legs go too low. Well, what if we just be careful? That's scary. If I don't know how to move, or I have an injury, or have pain in movement, to tell me to be careful is potentially not very useful. I now am going to probably brace and over recruit, so I don't do that thing that I have to be careful of. So again, think about, can we get some more eccentric length of the hip flexor, better control of the torso. So use the opposite muscle groups. I'm a big fan of reciprocal inhibition. How can you use the opposite muscle group of what you want to have happen? So if I push long and out, I'm going to engage my hip extensors just a little bit, enough that hopefully I get that little response of hip flexor lengthening. So also examine, and it's like a whole nother 7 webinars in one, but just really listen to the things that you're telling your clients, and is it useful, and can you use the body itself? Can you use the nervous system? Can you use some reflexes that we have? All of these different things where they're now going to, again, have this internal experience, and you don't ever have to teach that again, because they will know how to do that, and it carries on to other exercises. So I'll stop.
Hey, you know what? You just made me think of. We wanted to get into another topic today as well that I think, Shelly, will just have to be on its own, which is understanding how to manipulate eccentric and concentric contractions, reciprocal inhibition, as sort of strategy to be able to teach movement to our clients. So I think that's going to be our next one. And we do have some good material to help you out with that. We're at the end of our day. We're at 4:01 for our webinar, and we certainly appreciate all of your attendance. Again, we want to remind you that we are celebrating our 30-year anniversary this week and next week, and our theme word in Movens Mundi in Latin is moving the world, and we want you to be that extension for us, moving the world. So keep up the great work of moving the world. We will see you in 2 weeks from today in another webinar, and maybe Shelly will join me again, since I think we're going to be maybe we continue this one. Shelly, would be a good idea if you're free.
I'd love it. I would love it.
Most importantly, we want to remind you to be kind and just keep things moving. I was going to say there was studies I was looking at recently about dosing of activity, and the best thing we could do for anybody anywhere in the world is get them moving, increase their dosing of activity, of movement. It doesn't matter what it is, just get them moving. It will benefit their cognitive levels. It'll benefit their social, psychological, emotional, spiritual, and physiological performance. So movement, Movens Mundi. Thank you again, Shelly, and thank you all. We'll see you in 2 weeks.